on this episode of the WildFed podcast.
My job as a state moose biologist, that's all I do, is moose 24/7.
So it's human-induced changes to the landscape that are creating habitat that's actually really beneficial to the moose population.
Most moose managers think about managing moose in two different systems. One is a system with wolves, and one is a system without wolves.
I've heard that they have a salivary adaptation to all the tannins in their diet, like they're using their saliva like a solvent to drip tannins out through their mouth.
Lots of food out there for moose, no predators of moose, conservative hunting. What changes a moose population? 60,000 ticks sucking their blood and breaking down their body mass.
It'd be amazing what people would accomplish with just maybe a cooler and a tarp sometimes, you know? It's just people seem a lot of times like they're going into the woods almost expecting not to succeed or something, and then when they do, there's not a good plan in place.
Anybody who interacts with moose in some way, shape, or form is kind of awestruck by it, no matter how many times you see one.
Episode 96 of the WildFed podcast, Moose with Lee Kantar, is brought to you by Surthrival. If you're looking to increase testosterone levels without turning to pharmaceutical testosterone replacement therapy, you need to take a look at Surthrival's pine pollen. Pine pollen is a rich source of naturally occurring testosterone and a suite of other androgenic hormones that can be used to gently boost your T levels. Right now until the end of August, the coupon code RESTORE20 gets you 20% off all pine pollen products at surthrival.com. My favorite is Surthrival's Pine Pollen Pure Potency, an herbal elixir formulated with stinging nettle root to keep your body's free testosterone levels up while the pine pollen gently boosts them. It's got Siberian ginseng for hormone upregulation and maple syrup, vanilla bean, and orange peel to give it an incredible flavor. Stop by surthrival.com to check out the entire pine pollen lineup, including pine pollen powder, tincture, and of course, pine pollen Pure Potency, Surthrival's flagship pine pollen product. Right now until the end of August, the coupon code RESTORE20 gets you 20% off all pine pollen products at surthrival.com. If you're drawn to hunting as a rite of passage, then it's time to check out sacredhunting.com. There's so many new or potential hunters that want to develop ancestral skills and intimate relationships with wild animals and the landscape, but who aren't drawn to the commercialization of modern hunting culture. But sacredhunting.com and its founder, Monsell Denton, are different. Sacred Hunting provides a space for new hunters to learn to stalk, harvest, and field dress animals in conjunction with indigenous-style ceremonies that introduce you to hunting in a more intentional and spiritually connected way. Monsell and his team will guide you through beginner hunts, and more advanced hunters will find unique opportunities available across the country and globe, like Axis deer hunts on Molokai in Hawaii, and even a northern Siberia hunt with the Nenets people coming up in 2022. There's only a few spots available for each hunt, so go to sacredhunting.com and complete their 2-minute application. Discounts are available when you let them know you heard about them on the WildFed podcast. Again, go to sacredhunting.com and learn more about Monsell and Sacred Hunting on episode 59 of the WildFed podcast. I'm Daniel Vitalis, and you're listening to the WildFed podcast, a show about reconnecting with nature through hunting, fishing, foraging, and food. WildFed. Food is all around you. Moose. They're the largest member of the deer family, and no one knows them better than our guest today, Lee Kantar, Maine's state moose biologist and head of its moose management program. Moose live solitary lives in the northern forests of the contiguous United States, Canada, Alaska, Fennoscandia, the Baltic states, and Russia. With their enormous bodies and broad palmate antlers, they look almost like a remnant of the Pleistocene epoch rather than an extant member of the cervid family. But we're lucky enough to have them on the landscape today in our modern era. Here in Maine, we have a thriving population, the largest in the lower 48, but our tags are coveted, released each summer after a much-anticipated lottery drawing. Many Mainers have a moose hunt story to tell, though some, like myself, are still waiting for that elusive tag. Each year when the recipients' names are released, I immediately start at V. When I don't see Vitalis on the list, I go back to A and start scrolling for other folks I know that might have drawn, because it's always fun to celebrate your friends' tags too. While moose are majestic, if not a bit goofy on those long, spindly legs, they're also facing several threats, not the least of which is the winter tick, an ectoparasite that's literally been bleeding our moose population to death. Add to that the threat of brainworm and chronic wasting disease, and it soon becomes apparent why the work of Lee Kantar and his colleagues is so important. The process of humans domesticating the landscape has been bad for much of the world's megafauna. Our lifestyle on the planet seems, in many cases, to be selecting for smaller species. It's my hope that moose, animals that can weigh 1,500 pounds or more and stand nearly 7 feet at the shoulder, can stay with us in perpetuity. Unlike their relatives, the white-tailed deer, moose don't thrive in and around us in the edge habitats between our homes and the forests, farms, and ag land that surround us. Habitat is crucial. It's also important for us to understand what helps them thrive and what leads to their ultimate demise. That's why Lee is flying around in helicopters counting moose, wrangling them for the tagging program, and racing to the scene when a caller shows a mortality to perform a necropsy on the spot. All that data is fed back into a management program that's goal is ensuring moose have a future here with us, not just for the hunt, but for their own intrinsic value on the landscape too. So while I'm eagerly awaiting a tag, my turn at bringing home hundreds of pounds of beautiful, dark, rich venison, I'm also happy to wait. Good management is more important, and ultimately, I just want to keep seeing moose in the North Country, and occasionally in my backyard too.
Lee Kantar, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Good to meet you.
Good to meet you.
Tell us your job description. What do you do here?
Well, a lot of people don't know this with the state of Maine versus other New England states, but we're really actually pretty fortunate in Maine with the Fish and Wildlife Department because right here in our Bangor office, we have statewide species specialists. And so all of the specialists dealing with everything from moose to freshwater mussels have statewide responsibilities. And then we have 7 regional offices where we have wildlife biologists who are kind of jack of all trades. So in other words, my colleagues in New Hampshire and Vermont, who are great folks, they might do moose, but they also have to do other work like do deer checks or do waterfowl surveys or something. So in my job as the state moose biologist, that's all I do. And that's cool. 24/7. And yeah. So obviously I have a lot of passion for it. And that's all I do is moose.
Yeah. I want to ask you why moose and how did that happen?
I mean, why am I doing my job?
Well, we'll get to that, but for you specifically, what drew you to moose, or how did moose kind of become a big part of your life?
Well, I mean, it's actually there's 2 different stories to that. One is that being in a position like I have is a lot of it has to do with timing. Mm-hmm. You obviously need to have the education and experience to do the work. But in order to do a job like this, timing is critical because my predecessors, both as the deer biologist when I started and the moose biologist, had been here for over 30 years. And there's only one.
Yeah.
There's not multiple positions. And so you really have a lot of luck. And you're told when you're doing wildlife school that you don't ever want to have your heart set on, well, I'd really like to study bears, right? Yeah. You really need to think critically about the types of problems you'd like to deal with as a wildlife manager or researcher, because trying to work on a particular species, that's a challenge for a variety of ways. But I'm fortunate because when I grew up in New Hampshire, I spent a lot of time in the woods, right, like many of us, and always really liked the North Country. So the spruce fir country, the mountains.
Getting up to that transitional forest up there.
Yeah, and the remote places.
Yeah.
And then along with that, the suite of species that occupy those areas were always of particular interest to me, right? Because they're trying to make a living in an environment that's, at least on that scale, can be pretty hard.
Pretty food poor up there compared to down here where we have the oaks and the maples and all these deciduous trees.
Yeah, it's definitely different, and obviously as you go south through New England, it is very different, especially with some of those foods. So you get an appreciation for an animal that sustains itself through some pretty serious conditions. And of course, moose obviously is a huge draw for many people. It's anybody who interacts with moose in some way or shape or form is kind of awestruck by it. I think no matter how many times you see one, and pretty neat critter.
When's the first time you saw one?
Well, I don't know. I couldn't tell you, but I can only tell you that when I was an undergrad, my first time around, outside of when I was in New England, and I went to school in kind of the big city for a little while, every weekend I go back to hike in the White Mountains. And this was in the early 1980s. And I try to take photos. I don't know if you remember back then, but there's actual film.
Yeah.
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah, right.
And
you didn't know what you got till you went and got them. You went and picked them up,
It's hard to believe, isn't it?
It's changed a lot, yeah.
And it's not that long ago. But going up to the White Mountains, I'd always be like really looking forward to hopefully maybe seeing a moose. And I have this really grainy kind of picture of a big cow moose, which I pigged back about 1984 or something like that. No, that's when so maybe 88. But anyways, it's interesting to look back on dates and times because, of course, the moose hunt itself going across New England and the recolonization of moose, beginning with Maine and opening our hunts. Our hunt started in 1980. New Hampshire started in 1988. And then Vermont followed suit in 1992. Okay. And so I think back about those times in the whites and thinking, that was right in that era where they were starting the New Hampshire moose hunt. And who would ever thought that today in 2021 that this is what I'd be doing?
Yeah.
No idea.
Yeah.
No idea. So.
Wow, that's pretty interesting to hear about. I want to talk about what makes Maine unique with moose, but let's actually start maybe at the beginning. So I keep looking at the scientific name, and I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it right. So I want to get the genus and specific epithet from you. Is it Alcis? Alcis?
Alcis, yeah.
Alcis?
Yeah.
Yeah. Is there anybody else in the genus?
There's a lot, and in the genus Alcis, no, I'm sorry, but there's 4 North American subspecies, which you probably know about.
Okay. Right? No, I actually really don't.
So our Alcis americana is the eastern moose.
Okay.
And then you have this kind of intergrade as you go west across Canada to the Canada moose. And then you
Canadensis.
And then you have the Shearer's moose, which is in the Rockies going up through Wyoming in that area. And then, of course, you have Gigas, which is the Alaskan moose. Okay. Whether I pronounce that right or not, somebody might pick on me. But
those are the 4 North American.
Right.
But then how big is the range? Because it actually goes, it's a latitudinal band around the globe where we find them.
Right. So there's some crazy subspecies out there from Eastern Europe into places like, Russia and all the way across that country, you're getting into a place I know nothing about. But there's one in I believe China.
Wow.
But Poland, we had so our North American Moose Conference, which I hosted back in 2019, is actually international at scale. Obviously a lot of Canadians, but also Scandinavians and Russians and all this. And so every 4 years, I think it goes international. And so a few years ago, they had it in Poland, not Poland, Maine, but Poland, the country.
The country.
And it was like, Poland, like they have moose in Poland, right? I have no idea, and very interesting. I didn't go to that one. I was kicking myself. I should have, but they
call them elk over there.
I think they do. But very, very different circumstances than what we deal with in North America.
To our eye, all these subspecies of moose would look pretty similar. I mean, are there any really distinguishing features, morphologically? I've
been out to Alaska a few times, but, I can't brag about it. But, to me, they have a very, very light coat. Okay. Now, I've only been out there to visit, so it's not like I've been out there all year and see what the molt looks like when they change coats versus Maine. But obviously, Alaska is known for a bigger moose. And so you can gain a larger size for a bull and probably a larger antler spread versus us. I think the Canada moose and the eastern moose, there's probably not huge differences. It's not like I certainly wouldn't be like, nor would I really care.
Right.
The whole subspecies thing. But the Shearer's moose is the smallest. Mm-hmm. And I've seen Shearer's moose in Wyoming, but I couldn't tell you.
Tell us a little bit about...
so now that you made it look like I know nothing about moose...
we haven't got to your state yet, where I would expect that you do know a thing or two.
There's other moose?
No. So here in Maine, and it's so funny to go to the moose drawing, the lottery, and you hear people getting drawn from places like Alaska all the time. It's just kind of frustrating, where you're like sitting there waiting for a tag, not getting one, and you're hearing people all over get them, but... So goes the draw, but
don't get me started. Go ahead.
But Maine is sort of really recognized for moose. What's going on here? Tell us about our population dynamics. Tell us about, and I'd love to hear a little bit of the history, because I read something this morning about there was a period of time not that distant when we were down to something like 2,000 individuals.
So, I don't mean to sound, I don't know what the word for it is, but, moose are not, it's not rocket science, as we like to say, right? Because moose, being a large animal, eat a lot. And when I say that to people, I'm not saying that to be a jerk, but it's of all the herbivores, right? A moose is spending all this time eating 30 pounds of food a day in the summertime.
Wow.
Vegetation, right? So it's amazing when you think of that, to sustain a body at that size.
Yeah.
But the thing about the Northeast, Maine, and that includes New Brunswick and Quebec, and then going down to Massachusetts, Connecticut, and the Adirondacks, is that most moose managers think about managing moose in two different systems. One is a system with wolves, and one is a system without wolves.
Oh, okay.
And it's pretty straightforward, and it's not a value judgment about wolves or anything like that. It has nothing to do with all that. People can say what they want about any of this stuff, but south of the St. Lawrence in Quebec, there's no wolves, and so moose do not have any predators. Okay, now people will argue this and that, but yes, a bear will eat a calf during the first month of its life, may kill and eat that calf. It could be predatory. It could be just salvaging something that's
pretty opportunistic, though, right?
Yeah, but either way, that's what we all got to eat something. We have absolutely no evidence of coyotes dealing with moose at all.
Seems unlikely to me.
And so we're 8 years into research using GPS collars, following moose around. When a moose dies, we go in the woods, we take it apart, we look at the cause of death. We're Johnny on the spot. For the first 7 years, it was a 24/7 response to recovering those moose and finding cause of death.
Okay.
And, coyotes aren't taking down moose.
Yep.
Okay, so we cleared that up. And so in the Northeast, you have a system where you have no top-down predators, and then you have a habitat that's characterized by commercial forestry.
Mm-hmm.
And so they cut lots of trees. They have a very large footprint, meaning the commercial forest lands, and they have short rotation forestry. And so that food for moose is being constantly regenerated over time and just trading places. And that's why we have a ton of moose.
Okay.
So you look at New York State, and not to say anything about New York State or any value judgments, but they have pockets of moose in and around the Adirondacks. Well, the Adirondack Park is forever wild. And the only place that they cut trees at a scale that has any meaning for a moose is in private land holdings. So if the three of us got up and took the helicopter today and flew over Maine and flew over the Adirondacks, we'd be like, oh, that makes a lot of sense why there's a lot of moose in Maine.
Because when you knock down trees, they get access to food, plus you get successional growth, and that's what they're feeding on?
Yeah, and of course, you were saying before about the history, and the history is it's very interesting, but of course, there's more moose today than there ever were, in the last 20 years, more moose in Maine than there ever was. And that's because...
Like pre-Columbian, even.
Yeah, because back in the day, before we came around and cut trees and developed
metal
places,
tools,
and before mechanized forestry, we just could not have that kind of an impact on the scale of the woods that we have starting really in the 70s. But the other thing that came along in Maine, and of course northern Maine was the land of caribou and moose, right, until the turn of the last century, end of the 1800s. You had a few caribou left, and it was caribou and moose. And in fact, white-tailed deer never existed in northern Maine. They were not recorded in northern Maine until the late 1800s. Mm-hmm. It's about the 1870s up in the Rangeley area, and I may have this backwards, and it may be the 1890s going up towards, Allagash, St. John, up in that area. No deer. Well, because you need to cut down trees for deer too, and
there's no mast crop up there.
No mast crop, and you need to have a break in a severe winter so you can have better deer survival, so they can get a foothold.
Right.
So anyways, as that changed, deer came into the country more throughout the 1900s for various reasons, mostly caused by us, farmland, conversion of farmland, small woodlots, things like that. But moose...
humans creating all that edge habitat that they need.
Right. So in the 1960s, the state of Maine, it was a high point for mature spruce and fir on the landscape. So we had more... So when you think of Maine north of Bangor. We had more mature spruce and fir than probably ever, right? But then the spruce budworm came along, that little insect, and it really crippled the North Country, not just Maine, but into New Brunswick and Quebec, and stuff was falling down. Trees were coming down, and the companies came in and did some salvage work, and so then you created these massive clear cuts, waves of cuts all across the land, and you completely turned over the forest to a regenerating forest, and then moose went,
Okay.
that was the growth, and you can follow that growth, from Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont. They made their way all the way down to Connecticut.
Yeah.
And that lasted for quite a while, and through the 70s and 80s. We were probably in the late 90s at our high point for moose in the Northeast, everywhere.
Yeah.
And then we have a new problem, which is climate change and dealing with winter ticks.
I want to get to those pathogens and parasites in a minute, but I just want to make sure I'm hearing you correctly. So it's human-induced changes to the landscape that are creating habitat that's actually really beneficial to the moose population. So it's that. Oh yeah. It's forestry.
Yeah, commercial forestry. It's interesting because a lot of people don't realize, especially if people aren't familiar with Maine, that number one, Maine is a remote place. A big chunk of it, 16,000 square miles, and it's commercial forest lands. These are private companies who bought the land and make wood products, right? Mm-hmm. It's a forest economy. That's fantastic, and they allow access for the public, which is a dynamic that nobody has in any other states. Out west, we're very fortunate. It's awesome. We have lots of public lands. But out here, the majority of Maine is privately owned. There's very few public lands.
96% or something.
Yeah, so very huge. And of course, when we as humans change our environment and change the landscape and the habitat, some critters win, some critters lose.
Yep.
And that's the way it is. And and then we obviously have the struggle as a agency that manages fish and wildlife, because if you don't own the land, what can you say to folks?
Right.
This is what you can do. This is the possibilities out there. So you don't have a lot of regulation versus asking people, would you consider, helping to manage for this and that? I mean, there is definitely regulation out there, but it's a very different mix in a private working forest like we have.
What keeps them, we've benefited from our time up in the Northwoods tremendously, and I've always wondered what's the benefit to them to maintain that access for us? Is it just tradition, or is there a financial benefit or subsidies or anything like that?
Oh, for the North Maine woods?
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
I think there is a lot to
Seems
tradition.
like a lot of liability to let everybody in there.
Yeah, I think it's been a very strong tradition, and one that, to the credit of the owners, is that they still embrace, and there's challenges there for sure. There's absolutely challenges. We always tell people, especially for moose hunts, is that when you're behind the checkpoints there, you're on private roads, and you need to respect the landowners. Yeah. And if you're driving those roads, you need to give way, and it can get crazy.
Yeah, I mean, when one of those tractor trailers is coming your way with a load of logs, you better get out of the way.
Yeah,
they're not stopping.
Yeah, and we spend a lot more time in the moose world. I do up there in the wintertime and spring when they're hauling a lot. And so it's a little bit different then. So you don't have a lot of recreationists in there. But
it's incredible how well those roads are maintained in the winter too. I mean, just amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're really lucky. Going back to what you said before about, that's interesting that moose managers in places where there's wolves are dealing with a whole different set of circumstances.
Yep.
And you mentioned bears sort of opportunistically feeding on calves, which I'd love to hear a little bit about. And then we've got a friend, Arthur Haynes, a botanist, who I consider a pretty reliable witness. He told me about a moose he saw that had, big red scars of, raking down its back that looked like a bear had got to it. So I'm curious, I know that's anecdotal, but do you ever see anything like that? Does that sound like far-fetched to you?
Oh, I don't know. I'm not going to question what somebody else sees and say that it's not real or whatever.
But it's not something you see frequently.
We hear, we've had people talk about the scars on the actual hind legs itself, so below the butt, which is something that, moose are afflicted by the actual moose fly during the summertime.
Okay.
That's not the deer fly. It's not a horse fly. It's an actual moose fly. It looks like a little fly, and it can bite. And there's hordes of them on moose all summer. Some people think they're ticks, but there's no ticks on moose, no winter tick on moose in the summertime.
In the summer, okay.
So what happens is they actually, the moose fly's life cycle includes laying their eggs in the moose dung.
Okay.
So they're kind of I'm forgetting the word for it, like an obligate species.
Yep.
So you can ask those guys about that.
They can't survive without the moose, basically. Yeah.
But when we caught moose in the water for our study, the hordes of flies when we had the moose next to us, the hordes of flies would come up in the air, and then they'd be in our boat with us, and then we'd have to zoom our boat down the water to get the moose flies off of us. But they cause, when they're biting on the hind legs, you'll see that it looks like something's beat the snot out of their hind legs. They can get bacterial infections and can get pretty nasty and look like raw meat on the back of their legs.
Oh, wow.
That's moose flies. That's what flies do.
That do that to them, yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, and they do that across all of moose range.
Okay.
That's just a common thing. Actual scratches on the rear. We've seen females with some injuries when a bull's mounting a cow. Once in a while you'll see something crazy, but most necropsies that we've seen are more routine than anything else.
Yeah.
Moose get themselves into trouble. Once in a while they have accidents. We had a moose that died on our study, and this was amazing because there was actually a picture of the exact same phenomenon in the North American Moose Book. But the moose had gotten its front leg caught in the crotch of a tree. So it got its leg up here, and you can...
Doing what?
Feeding? Who knows?
Yeah.
And then it was on the ground like this.
Whoa.
And it died a miserable death.
Laying on its side with its leg up?
Right, because the hoof of a moose, of course, is larger and wider than the joint itself. So it basically
wedged it in there.
And it was very interesting. But of course, moose, especially cows, will rear up on their hind legs and defend themselves with their front legs. They can reach up to kind of grab something. I mean, it was a strange place. My friend, who's a really good wildlife biologist, very observant. You just sit there and you're looking at this thing, scratching your head, going, I don't know.
Yeah.
Wasn't there.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about like a life in the year of moose. Like, what's the life history like, and what's their annual cycle look like as far as like what they're up to?
Well, I mean, it's pretty straightforward. I mean, and it all depends on whether you're a bull or a cow, right? Because whether you're having a calf or not. But right now during the summertime, obviously moose spend a lot of time in wetlands, and they do that in a place like Maine because we have a lot of wetlands, right? And so people always associate moose with wetlands and bogs, and it's kind of the classic thing. But, some of that is a factor of the landscape itself.
Right.
And, in Maine, you can't throw a stick, right, as they'd like to say, without hitting some wet spot.
Mm-hmm.
And, moose love wetland areas because aquatic vegetation is rich in sodium.
Okay.
And they can go in there and they can feed and have a party, and they can get a lot of food, and then they can go back in the woods and ruminate and hang out in the shade. A lot of people, I don't buy this myself, a lot of people think they go in there because of the insects. Well, they're getting hit by insects wherever they go.
Right.
And
pretty big target.
Yeah, and more times than not, what moose will do is they'll go up on a spot, and it's hard to say this in Maine, but it'll just be a spot where there's enough of a difference or change in elevation where wind is the big factor. So wind's going to help them deal with bugs more than anything else. But from my perspective and yours, we get out in the woods, we're harassed by bugs, and we're like, how can you deal with this? Well, we're not moose, right?
Yeah.
That's a moose is born into that. We don't have that perspective of what that's like. It looks horrible, right? But so they spend their summertime in there, and of course, along with wetlands is pockets everywhere of different size and different age stands that have been cut, where there's lots of moose food. And so moose are spending time in there. So they're spending their whole day and night where they're feeding. They're moving to a place where they bed down, they ruminate, maybe they catch some Z's, get up and feed, and they do this all the way into the fall. And then when things start to senesce and die back, then they're not spending time in wetlands. They may be 100 yards over here, and they're spending all their time in cut blocks, places that have been harvested from September, October, all the way till about February. And then in February, as the days get longer, and depending on the snow pack, meaning the snow depth and the consistency of that snow, they may spend more time, seeking some cover with spruce and fir. But they're still feeding. They're probably not feeding as much as they do. But their home ranges can shrink incredibly. In fact, we've had moose where, so a moose may have a 10 to 12 square mile home range, and every moose might be a little bit different, but in the wintertime those shrink. It's just like a deer with wintering conditions. We've had moose that their home ranges are so small, we thought one of the moose was maybe dead with the collar on it. It wasn't sending out a mortality signal, but we're like, it's like the size of this room. We're like, what the? And that was a year where we had a lot of snow. And when everything started to recede and the conditions are just right, of course, the moose is like, I'm out of here, and expands its home range.
Okay.
What are moose eating in the summer versus the winter?
So, of course, in the summertime, you do have some more variety because you have actual green leaf matter. And, of course, you have protein that goes along with that. And so moose really like, shrubs, basically, and small trees. So they can strip a tree and eat all the leaves off of those. And then when everything dies back in the fall, they're really eating the new growth on those trees, the new shoots, and hammering those.
I see them on striped maples eating that cambium.
Yeah, so they'll bark trees, and of course, as you know, they just have bottom incisors for doing that. They have no top front teeth, and so they like to strip those trees. They like striped maples. They love red maple. Occasionally, once in a while, we'll see it on a yellow birch. They'll do that on mountain ash.
Okay.
It's interesting because deer do that, but it's always considered starvation diet. So you'll see deer doing that on little hemlock trees, and stripping those trees when there's nothing else to eat. But a moose doesn't do that. A moose appears to just like the taste of bark on a nice red maple.
On the striped maples, I tap red maples at home, so I get that. On the striped maples, I always wondered, could you tap them for syrup? They're such small trees, but I've noticed where the moose have got to it, they'll exude a bit of their sap, and then as it concentrates in the sun, if you taste it, it's really sugary. So the carbohydrate content must be pretty high. Yeah. Is it true that I've heard that they have a sort of a salivary adaptation to all the tannins in their diet? Like they're using their saliva like a solvent to drip tannins out through their mouth.
We'll get right back to the show in a moment, but first, hunting season is right around the corner. Are you interested in learning to hunt effectively with skill and good ethics, but feeling overwhelmed at how much there is to learn, or not knowing where to start? Or maybe you just need some support to make it finally happen. Maybe you've already begun your hunting journey, but want to increase your skills and knowledge to help you harvest more successfully and consistently. Either way, check out The Hunter's Journey at thehuntersjourney.com. I can tell you from personal experience, being able to walk into the woods and bring home food to feed my family and community is one of the most empowering and rewarding feelings I know. It increases self-reliance, provides excellent food, and is an avenue for land stewardship and deep nature connection. But getting started can be challenging, especially if you weren't raised in a hunting family. There's many barriers to overcome, like finding places to hunt, choosing what gear to use, learning the skills of the hunt, and knowing how to process your harvest afterwards. Chris Gilmore from episode 58 on tracking and awareness has designed this inclusive course and community to help you overcome those barriers and make the dream a reality for you. This course will walk you through step by step, beginning wherever you are now, all the way up to successful harvests and beyond. And Chris has extended a special offer for WildFed listeners. Go over to thehuntersjourney.com to watch the trailer and enter the coupon code WildFed100 for $100 off the course. Again, that's thehuntersjourney.com and enter the coupon code WildFed100 to get $100 off and to take the next step in your hunter's journey. Now, back to the show.
If you look at all these different ungulates that are out there, they all have different volume, some scientists will talk about the volume of saliva compared to help explain why the diet of an herbivore is different. So you have something like a bison that probably has a diet higher in grass, whereas a moose is not an eater of grass. And a lot of that has to do with the saliva first, having enough saliva to be able to start the breakdown of your food components before you bring it into your gut and go into the next thing. And moose have a high volume of saliva, but I don't think they're the big winners compared to some other species in that. But, I'd have to look back at the rhyme and reason to that.
Yeah, the saliva charts.
Yeah, at the saliva charts. Well, it's one of those things where, once in a while we're asked to go into a urban, suburban situation and remove a moose, and do that maybe by drugging a moose. And one of the things that's always a component of that is saliva. And so I was just thinking about this going, I remember my wife, who's also a wildlife biologist, was able to come out with me once, because we have kids, so we can't be together in the field.
Yeah.
And I remember at one
What's she work on?
She does great blue herons and loons and colonial birds.
Cool.
So I was down east, and I was responding to a moose in an orchard, and I was going to dart it, and I didn't have my gear. So I knew the only person I could call who could understand my garbage talking would be her to get the gear I needed. And sure enough, I called her up. She's like, yeah, I can do that. I can be there in an hour. Can you get this, this, and this? Yep. So she grabbed all the gear and came. So she got to be there, darted the moose. But she, somebody always has to hold the head up.
Wow.
Because you got to remain, you got to keep an open passageway. And of course, along with that, you pull the tongue out, and then the saliva starts.
Oh,
so if you're the one holding the moose, you're like,
getting wet.
This is different, this is different. So,
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I'd love to hear a little bit about actually, before, I just want to get a little more on moose.
So that's a picture. That's my daughter holding a moose head of a live moose.
The head is bigger than her torso,
Yeah, exactly. So
wow.
She got to get slimed, too, by a moose. Everybody should once in their lifetime.
For people listening, just kind of give them a sense of what are typical weights, and then what's a real big animal.
Well, it's interesting because, everybody in every field, we have the North American Book of Moose, the Bible of Moose. And so it's everything you'd ever want to know about moose.
That's an actual book you're talking about? Where do I get that?
It's the Ecology and Management of Moose in North America. And it was updated a few years ago. There's one on elk, and so it's got chapters on everything. But anyways, they'll talk about those subspecies you and I were talking about and more. And so there's a quote in there about the size of an eastern moose, and I look at that and I go, wow, we definitely have moose that have been bigger than that. But that's, we have dressed weight of moose from the hunter harvest, since 1980, so we can look at that. But then you have to configure what would be the live weight of that moose, okay? And so the biggest moose that ever was taken in Maine was in 1982 in Masardis. That was the second year of the hunt, because there was no hunt in 1981 because of the politics. And it was a young guy named Waterman, who I want to say was with his father, and they shot this massive bull. They had to cut it up, bring it out of the woods. They weighed it, and the parts were...
They quartered it?
Yeah, the parts were 1,300 plus pounds. Now, to put that into perspective, you can only trust that was accurate in 1982. We can't... That was verified. So you put that together, and you're talking about, let's say, blood volume and everything else that goes with it is maybe 30%.
Yeah.
So you multiply that out, and now you're talking a moose that's well over 1,600 pounds.
Wow.
In fact, I think that might have been calculated out to 1,700. But don't quote me. I'm middle-aged. And so that's a big moose. Now, since that time, with all the moose hunted, we've had a few moose in the 1,200 pound. And then every year we always get moose that are over 1,000 dressed. Okay. So a bull moose that's dressed at 1,000 pounds, let's just say that's, what's 30% of 1,000 pounds?
300.
So 1,300 pound moose. Okay.
Now, is that let's say your 200 pound deer in Maine is sort of your benchmark for a big deer? Is that your sort of benchmark? A grander's like a benchmark for a
I think
big
for
moose?
Hunters, that's their benchmark. It's like a 55-inch plus spread.
Yeah.
If that's something you like,
Don't care about that, but yeah.
It's, what I mean? It's like, but it's a big moose. And of course, obviously a moose that's attained made it to a prime age for a bull, that'd be, let's say, a 5-year-old bull. We've had moose that live as long as 19 years, in the harvest.
Harvested animals that are 19 years old. You take a tooth sample or something?
Right. We take a canine. Mm-hmm. We probably have the biggest set of information on moose ages than anybody anywhere because of the requirement to bring out the moose during the hunt since 1980. So we probably capture 95% of those ages by cementum annuli. So we take the tooth, section it, and read it like the rings in a tree.
Yeah, similar to what they're doing in the black bear program.
Yeah, or the bear program is doing similar to what we do.
Oh, snap.
Oh, man, if Randy was listening now.
I know. Oof, beef.
Probably bears have been doing longer.
It's a slightly younger program, if I understand it. Yeah. But the moose program here in Maine, because obviously there's moose programs around the country, and then some of the nations that you mentioned that also have moose. But we're pretty far ahead in this game, you think, here?
As far as
the science that's being done.
Well, now you got to make me brag or something.
Yeah, well, that's kind of what I'm trying to do. I'm setting you up here.
Yeah, I mean.
So I just threw you a softball.
You know, as a government agency, everything's dependent on funding, resources, and then taking action, right? Yeah. And you know, I like to always say that I've been incredibly fortunate, because when I got here, I've been working for the department for 16 years, and I started with deer. I came in at a time when we were working on deer where we didn't have anything going. You know, we didn't have any projects going. Money had been really, really tight. And I actually remember getting to a point where there was talk about us being able to get out and get grants. You know, and people are like, what are you talking about? You guys are the state and you have all this money and blah, blah, blah. It's like, well, there's other agencies in the state of Maine. There's a ton of them, right? And it used to be that the 4 natural resource agencies in the entire state, which was us, marine resources, environmental conservation, and agriculture, it was like we had like 4% of the money from the general fund.
Really?
So all the money that comes in across the entire state of Maine for all this type of stuff, we got a tiny. So
the hunting license money and stuff went into a general fund.
No, we get that stuff.
Okay.
But when people think about having employees and paying them salaries and paying for gas and
keeping
your truck,
these buildings warm.
yeah, there's not much left over
right.
to do some kind of study or something.
Yeah.
And so anyways, long story short is over a decade ago, you know, I had worked out west in the western United States. I did my graduate work in New Mexico and Colorado. I worked in Washington State. They do a lot of flying out west. Anyways, I was here and my buddy kept telling me, you know, the Maine Forest Service flies all the time. They have helicopters. I'm like, yeah. And finally, a year later, I went over there and we were talking, and it's like, yeah, they have helicopters and they're open to doing more work with us. And so I started up this aerial survey project for deer at the time, based on work that had been done in New Brunswick and Quebec.
Okay.
And my buddy was the provincial deer biologist, and then first fur biologist, then deer biologist in New Brunswick. And knowing somebody like me is not very smart, he was able to tell me, you know, how to do this, you know, how to do some aerial survey for deer. And so we did it for deer, and it did not work very well in our big deer country. And we feel that, you know, Maine is small enough that where deer are more towards southern and central Maine, if they're used to things flying over their heads, if a deer just stands there, and we do this in the wintertime, you're never going to see it. I'm not going to see it. They need to run, and we're flying 200 feet above ground.
Okay.
And so that winter we were thinking about it, and we're going, the statistics behind the model to count animals, it's not a deer versus a moose versus a snowshoe hare. It's just whatever you see. If you see enough of them, you can count them. So we're like, why couldn't we do this for moose?
Yeah.
And so we basically were able to make this program and turn it into a moose aerial survey.
Okay.
And we were very, very successful, because when you're flying between after muzzleloader season to about February, when I was telling you moose
for people listening, muzzleloader season for moose for deer is
2 weeks of December.
Yeah, so a bit of snow on the ground usually then, and
so we'd wait till that's over. There's going to be snow on the ground for contrasting with animals, and we fly this survey 200 feet above ground, and it's more complicated than that. But anyways, we're flying 7 25-mile transect lines within a management district, and you want to be able to see animals, and we'd see moose just everywhere.
Wow.
And so it was really exciting, because we were able to parlay this into a statistical survey and get some pretty good estimates of moose. And you also see a lot of country. You see a lot of moose country. And we also discovered that, like other jurisdictions, the nice thing about moose and flying for moose is that you can sex and age moose, bull, cows, and calves.
Okay.
You can't do that with other animals. All cow moose have a V-shaped white vulva patch under their tail. That's a female moose. Males, 99% of males do not have one. And there's other features. A cow moose has a uniform brown face that can fade as it gets older. A bull has a bicolor face with a black muzzle, which is driven by testosterone. They have different bell shapes. So when the antlers fall off a moose in the wintertime and it's running from you, you can still differentiate. So you
from
can
200 feet.
Yeah, well, sometimes lower. So you can tell bull, cow. So you start to, you can build ratios, and then
all from the air.
All from there. And you can do cow-calf ratios. And so we statistically figured out, too, that when we first started doing this, we just do as many as we can. And, of course, you start to circle, and you got to be able to handle that, physically, your stomach flying like that.
Yeah.
And our ranger pilots are great guys and do a fantastic job. In fact, they're like having two additional biologists now because they're so good at sex and aging moose while flying and habitat. They just know. Yeah. And we've had this dynamic for over a decade in Maine where we fly every year, and we fly over the North Country, and it's been a great program because it gives us some real powerful and scientific data. And also, there's all kinds of stuff that when you're explaining to the public and to everybody else, it's difficult to translate the side benefits as a biologist to being out in the field. So, as we all know about the scientific method and publishing papers and all this, but it's always hard to say, because when somebody says anecdotally, well, your friend there saw a moose with scratches on it. Well, that's a sample of one. So what do we do with that? How do we take that observation and say, no, this is what's happening? Well, for an observation of one, we can't. So we need more than that. And, it's great to do all the work we've done. Again, we've done the aerial survey work, and we have actual numbers, but we see so much else as far as where moose are. And we're doing the same places over and over again over the years, and you see behavior and see this.
How do they respond to the helicopter coming over?
They run.
They do, yeah.
Which is critical. It's like
you need that movement to pick them up.
Yeah, I mean, when we do the transect surveys, we're just like humming across at 200 feet, constant above ground, flying as slow as you can go. That's why a plane doesn't work. We're going about 45 miles per hour, in fact.
Oh, yeah.
And you're locked in like this, looking out your window.
Right.
And we have a transect width that we see from the skid of our helicopter to a line on our window. And you're always looking like this, and it can be painful after a while.
You look just in that. Yes. You're not scanning the environment. You look just in there. No kidding.
And think about this.
That's got to be hard to do.
Well, think about this. When people are critical of a survey, right, and you go, tell me this, how do I fly across the North Woods and I'm just looking at 200 feet and I see moose all the time in 200 feet? How does that even work? Like mentally, when I think about it, it's crazy.
Yeah.
And of course, you can see a group of animals much easier than a single. And of course, if something's sitting still or bedded, and I used to put a GoPro camera by my feet and just watch. And I had a few where there was like a bedded moose ahead and then it got up and ran. And if it goes this way, it's in my count. If it goes the other side, the biologist who is doing other work for us sees it, but it's not part of our survey.
Oh, okay. It doesn't get counted.
No, it doesn't. No. So only if they flush to my side of the helicopter.
Whoa, no kidding.
Yeah, the two observers. So it's really, really interesting. And we've had flights where, we see snowshoe hares running.
Wow.
And you have to train yourself. We've seen other animals that are probably, a coyote here and there, but you have to train yourself. You can't do this. Because the second you do that, you're on a conveyor belt, and you're
for listeners, you can't turn your head away.
Right, you can't turn your head away. And each transect may take us, 45 minutes, and 45 minutes with your head locked in place, going like this.
Crick in your neck.
And you don't want to miss anything. So and then you get to the end of your line, you pick your head up, you're stretching, and it's like, all right, get ready for the next one. And we're in the next one. And it takes, obviously the day is shorter in the wintertime. And we have to have conditions where it's not a snowstorm.
Yeah.
And wind speeds have to be below 10. So it's very difficult to pull this off, but we do it. And we've been in snowstorms and things like that, and it's not fun.
Yeah.
It's not fun. But, it's an important part of our program.
Right. And then so out of that, there's some mathematical magic that happens, and that turns into a population estimate? Yeah. What's the estimate right now?
Well, so I never answer this directly, and people can say what they want about that. But, in 2012 was the last time. Well, I even have to back up further. So we have 29 wildlife management districts that make up the state. We don't hunt moose in every one, and we don't have a ton of moose in every one, clearly, as you go down south. So back in 2012, I said, well, look, it makes more sense that we call the core range where the commercial forest lands are. That encapsulates the moose that drive the state population. Mm-hmm. And there's moose that live outside of that.
I was gonna say, I've got them down to 15, but not many, obviously.
Yeah. But do they add a lot to the whole when you're talking about thousands? Hey, it gives us a buffer anyway there is. So we started doing, when we saw that was successful and gave us a decent estimate, we really piled it on. Let's do as many as we can get. The core range is 12 management districts that extend basically from Bethel all the way across the North Country east to maybe Danforth. Okay. Well, 2 of those zones in the Western Mountains we can't fly transects in because there's too much topography. Okay. You can't get a Jet Ranger with 4 guys and fuel load up that. You start to go up a hill and you're like, it can't be done. Okay. So you can't run a transect. And we thought about other ways to do that. But so, back in 2012, we had an estimate, and they have a range of values. We had an estimate of 76,000. People flipped out. Wow. Like, how can that be? The last time we looked on your website, you had 200 moose in Maine. Now I'm being silly about it, but yeah. This goes back to the science of dealing with apples versus oranges. And, Maine tried for years to figure out how many moose were here and there. It's a moving target. There's a confidence interval around the 76,000. So it could be way more, it could be way less within, thousands of moose. But it gives you a good idea of where we're at. And that number people went crazy about because they're like, well, I'm not seeing moose like I used to. Right? This was 2012. I'm not seeing moose like I used to. Well, maybe that's true. Maybe there are less moose, and maybe there were more moose when you saw that. But also since 1980, what else has changed?
Yeah.
Well, everything has changed.
Yeah, you didn't have YouTube back then, dude.
Yeah, habitat changes, clear cuts, what we can see. Yeah. And so I tell people, in the
people aren't out in the woods as much as they used to be either.
Yeah, but the thing is, in a survey like this, I hate to say it is what it is, but when you do a survey and you come up with a number based on the math and the statistics, that is the number. And so then you should try to poke holes in why you believe that number or don't believe that number, or what does it even mean, right? And people get too hung up on these things because the bottom line is we manage moose in the state for the people of Maine, and hunting permits, the level of hunting, has always been ultra conservative, very conservative. And that's fine for the most part until climate change and the rise of the winter tick has caused such a problem that, this is not where we want to be today.
Okay, so you didn't give me a number. Well, you said 76,000 back before.
Back 10 years ago.
What would you guess? What's your estimate today?
We can say whatever we want.
Yeah.
When I say 50, 60,000 moose, there's a wide margin of error in there. But there's a lot of moose. There's a lot of moose because, the reality is that when you get north of Moosehead Lake or west of and east of Moosehead Lake, in that rich country zones 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and parts of 7 and 8 and 9, it adds up pretty quick.
Yeah, and that's harder to survey out there.
Well, it's we don't do the western mountains there, but we do flights to do bull, cow, calf.
Okay.
And if I'm going out there and I'm just ticking off moose like this, sex and aging moose like this, do you think there's a few moose?
Yeah.
Yeah. There. Honestly, there is.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of moose habitat, and it's just a different system because, as we said at the beginning of this talk, which was lots of food out there for moose, no predators of moose, conservative hunting.
Yeah.
What changes the moose population? In our study over the last 8 years, we see that it's driven by the loss of moose trying to make it to their first birthday because of winter tick. So we lose calves in the springtime because they can't make it through. And then we feel that reproductive output capacity of cows has been depressed by having a winter tick load on them during their pregnancy, where you get 60,000 ticks sucking their blood,
nutritional
and breaking down their body mass before they're able to give birth to a neonate.
Okay, I want to get to this winter tick here in a minute, but on average, what it was about 2,000 tags a year from the lottery.
Yeah, right now with our adaptive hunt, this year is like 4,030.
Oh, are there? Oh, yeah, because the adaptive hunt. Do you want to explain that a little bit? I noticed on the website this year when I put in, there were some options there to participate in that.
Yeah, so the department's been talking for a number of years. The winter tick issue has been out there for a while that we've always obviously been talking about a lot, and so people want to know, well, what are we going to do about winter tick? And people talk about, well, why don't you spray the woods? Why don't you spray the moose, right? And why don't you put collars on the moose and all this? And those are legitimate questions. Honestly, the problem with a caricide, a tick killer on the moose is I tell people, it's a noble cause to want to protect a moose or 100 moose or whatever from the death of winter ticks, but that means nothing to the thousands of moose out there. It's not a population level problem solver, right? It's not going to happen. And unlike my 2 dogs that I give a pill to every month to deal with internal and external parasites, including ticks, I control my dog every day and give it a pill every day if I want to. So people have been critical of that, but you can't do that with a moose.
Yep.
And moose and winter tick is a whole different dynamic because of the ecology of the winter tick, which is a one-host species that lives for a year, and it's operating in the woods from September to May. Well, that's winter time, and it's tough to get on moose. I mean, when we do a moose capture, in 2020, our capture, we did 130 calves. Very expensive.
When you collar a moose, is it always a calf?
No. The original project, we did adult cows and calves.
I don't want you to lose this train, but I'm sitting here going like, how do you get a collar on a moose?
Yeah. Well, that's done
Sounds
through
like the start of a bad joke.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, so we've done 675 plus moose. The majority of moose are captured via net gun by helicopter capture. So we hire a crew to do it.
I want to be that guy. How do you? That sounds like a cool job.
Yeah, you could do that.
Lean out the helicopter with a rocket net.
Yeah, with a 308. It's a 308 discharge rocket net.
No kidding.
That has metal weights in the 4 corners. So when it shoots out, it goes like this. They have to be within 20, 30 feet of the moose.
And then they rappel down?
So they shoot the moose with the net gun. It tangles the moose. The helicopter immediately lands, and the mugger, the so-called moose mugger, jumps out, and they basically knock the moose over, and then they hobble it, the legs, and put a blindfold on it, and then the moose is mellow. So there's no drugs. There's no drugs in this.
Oh, okay, wow.
So once the moose has a blindfold on it, like many animals, they become
pretty docile.
Yeah. And so, you can take blood and fecals and all the things
without
that we do.
drugs.
Collar it, ear tag the moose.
Cool.
Well, and ear tag it. And so that process goes very quickly. Moose calves, which are now, I always have to think about this because of my small brain, but in January, they're 8 months old. They're weighed. So we weigh them with the helicopter. Then they're let go. And so then we monitor those animals with these collars that have GPS and VHF on it. A bunch of these moose, like I said, we did a bunch of capture in the water, so we captured about 25 to augment our population every year in our 2 study areas. Now we're in 1 study area.
You capture them in the water.
Yeah.
So same technique?
We you
obviously don't want them to drown.
We don't do it with drugs, which is the big part.
Yeah.
So we can actually work up a moose and put a collar on a moose and put ear tags in it. I think usually it was, when we got good at it, it was about 2 minutes. So anytime you handle a live animal, you want to minimize it.
Right.
It always drives me crazy whenever we have, like, people want to pet an animal, a wild animal. There's nothing a wild animal likes about you. Yeah. And no offense to you, Dan.
No, I don't take it personally.
Or any of us. They want to be away from you.
Yeah.
It's a stressful thing.
Sure.
So the shorter you can do this. So we had a technique that was that we saw was done in Maine back in the 80s with Marlon Perkins and Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom.
Yeah.
You can Google that. Okay. And they show people catching a moose in the water with who is his sidekick? Jim Fowler.
Okay.
And so he goes out, and it's right here in Maine on Moose Lake, and they're catching a moose, and it's a pretty cool video.
The moose is swimming?
And it's the same thing we do, yeah.
And they
swimming.
catch them with what?
So we catch them with a rope on a pole.
Yeah, like a lasso type thing?
Yeah, but we don't, but it's not like a...
Yeah.
Believe me, we tried that. That's not the way to do it.
Yeah.
But,
like a snare.
It's basically putting the rope on them, so we're now attaching the moose to our boat, and then as soon as we're ready, you can literally gently pull the moose. The moose is swimming next to you like this. I pull it over to my boat, grab my collar that we retrofit for the water, snap it on, let the moose go. It's still on the rope, and then give me the ear tags, pull the moose over, tag, and then I have a special clip on it that I undo, and the moose goes swimming up.
I'd love to see this.
We have lots of video.
There's video of it? Yeah, I'm just like, this is just like amazing to think about. I mean, the first time you did that, you must have been some nervous.
So the first time we did it, and we had, the student who was on the project lives in Wisconsin, and and works still, and another grad student who was on the project is in Maine. And so I talked to them, and I said, we we're going to do this because we need to augment. We can't have the guys from New Zealand fly out here to do another 10 moose. So he goes, well, watch that video and you'll really know. And I watched the video, and there's some nuances to it. But anyways, and
I'd hope.
And Mike, if he's listening, I think that's who it was saying that they did it to a point where they were using a canoe and all this. And we used a canoe and a little motor, but moose can power pretty good. They're really good swimmers. And, they can evade you, right? Because they're pretty good at doing this. So the first time we were in a canoe, had a little motor, and, we're sneaking up on them, We're trying to sneak up. And then at some point you got to get the motor going so you can really hum along them. And the first time we did it, we didn't have a collar, which is fine, but we had a false sense of security because basically we get out on this lake. We had done all kinds of scouting. We knew this was the lake to do it in. And we're paddling out in the first light and right there in the fog and like, oh, there's a cow on the point. Oh my God, there she is. She just walked in the water and now she's swimming. Because the big thing that they didn't tell us is that it's great when you see a moose swimming, but if the moose can still touch the bottom, yeah, you're in trouble. And so the first time we did this, we get in there with the canoe.
Because you can push off of that.
First time we catch the moose, everything's beautiful. We both look at each other like, like stupid, like, oh, that's great.
Easy.
That's easy. Next year we'll do it with a collar. So it's a long story, but the next year we basically it's a long story. We saw all these moose. We had 3 moose. So we're in the canoe. We're doing the same thing. We're hiding behind a stump. And we're looking at each other. The wind's in our favor. And we're like, okay, let's go for it. Let's go get these 3 moose. So we start paddling up. Every time the moose has its head in the water, you paddle a little bit closer. Then the moose picks its head up and you look around like, dude. And then you do it. It's like a cartoon.
Yeah, hiding behind a bush.
So we're just at that point where we feel like we can cut them off.
Yeah.
So between land and water, we cut them off. My buddy looks at me and he's like, which one do you want? And it's like, whatever one. And so we get one cut into the water, and we're on the moose. We call it. We get the rope on the moose, and then I had this stupid harebrained idea that I needed to use muscle, right? So now I'm basically strangling the moose. People listening, it wasn't really strangling them, but I'm exerting force, and then it turns out we learned very quickly the moose could touch the water.
Yeah,
so now we got the bucking bronco, and in fact the moose smacked me. And my collar goes, blip, 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 blip. Lost my collar in the water.
To the bottom. Yeah.
So we let that moose go. And a second later, my buddy looks at me and he goes, I got another collar. And so we caught that moose again. And by that point, my hands were so fatigued that I looked at him like this. Like,
oh, wow.
I was like looking at him with these cramped hands. I was like, I can't move the collar. So he jumps up in the canoe and gets the collar on the moose. We release it. There's a lot more to it, but we did recover that collar, by the way.
Oh,
too.
good.
But
yeah.
anyways, that was our first rodeo.
Okay.
And we discovered after that, and it was all blamed on me. That's not the way you do it.
You've developed some finesse.
So we
since
developed
then.
finesse, and literally, and we actually started to incorporate a bigger motorboat, and we'd do moose in 2 minutes. It just once we get the moose and we knew everything, all the clues, all the cues, we got down to a good science.
Wow.
So yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
My goodness.
Well, it's funny too because let's go on to the next question.
Go ahead. What were you gonna say?
No, my dear old dad. We took him out on one of our captures once because we could fit somebody in the middle. It was just a great moment. Because I get both my parents.
Wow.
But my dad came with us. Anyways, we got a moose, and we're going after this moose, and we thought it was a cow, and we got right up to it, and it's like it was a little bull. So we got the bull on, and we had the bull right next to the boat. And I look at my dad, I go, do you want to pat it? And, of course, getting up off the sea was a little challenge. He's like, no, I'm good. And, I let the moose go. It's like having a big fish on.
Yeah, right. Take a quick picture. So back to the adaptive hunt.
Yes.
Yeah,
okay.
and then maybe that can lead us into some of these ecological and
so we're talking about
problems.
This whole issue with how to deal with ticks. And the explosion of ticks that we've had now for, quite a long time. And the winter tick and its impact on moose has been known in the moose world in Canada and here, for decades. It's been a known ectoparasite on moose. And every once in a while, it gets to the point where a jurisdiction has such a bad winter tick year that they lose a lot of young animals. And then it seems like it fades away the next year. They don't see that again. And then maybe it cycles through years later.
They knock their own host population down, so then they struggle to recover themselves.
Their only host is the moose?
Well, they'll get on other animals, but the problem is that the moose is a naive host in the sense that it doesn't sense the larval ticks getting on them. So the larval ticks, once the eggs break out in the end of summer, that whole mass, which could be thousands of eggs, crawl up on a shrub and they wait for something to come by. And as long as you're giving off your body heat, a tick is going to get on you. So it doesn't matter. But when they get on something like
they've got some
deer,
kind of thermal sense?
Well, the CO2 that's coming off of you, they sense that, and that's where their little
Legs
appendages
go up,
come up. And then one gets on, and they all, like a barrel of monkeys, climb
Daisy
aboard.
chain on each other.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And so the belief is something like a deer, licks and grooms itself and scratches and senses the larvae, which are the size of like a kernel of rice.
Yeah.
Very small, but they're in mass on the animal. The moose seems to be the one that doesn't detect that until the middle of winter.
Grain of rice is one individual?
One larval tick.
One larval tick, yeah.
Right. So they get all these ticks on them. Some people say they look like red little mites. They're actually kind of brownish. Anyways, they get in mass on any animal that comes by. We've had them on snowshoe hare, on their eyes, any animal that's walking by. But they've evolved so that they like to hang out at a height that works really well in moose.
For moose, yeah.
So the moose get them in mass. They're on there. They take a blood meal, the larvae does, and then it's kind of in diapause. It doesn't do anything until maybe December or January, and then it morphs into a nymph.
But it stays on the moose?
Stays on the moose. It's living on the moose all winter long.
Wow.
They're all living. Tens of thousands of winter ticks.
Okay, because a lot of the ticks that we deal with as as human hosts, they're going to drop off after that blood meal and go do another thing.
Right.
These guys are staying put.
Right. So that's the difference between a one host and a multi-host. So the deer and dog tick that you've been dealing with and that I deal with, and that's exploded as well, mostly in southern and central and coastal Maine, has a different seasonal cycle, but they all require 3 hosts.
Yeah.
So they get on you and you're just one host, and then they're going to get off and hang out and morph and then get on something else, right?
Yep.
And so the winter tick doesn't do that. All 3 life stages on the back of the same animal.
Wow.
So in its nymphal stage in January, now the moose are standing up and noticing the ticks are on them. And that's when they start to scratch and lick and bite and rub the hair off themselves. And we believe there's a behavioral clue. So as you get older and you've been dealing with winter tick every year, you're better at dislodging these ticks. But back to the point is that other jurisdictions have seen this phenomenon in one season, but no other place except the Northeast has seen this year after year after year. So in 7 years of having collared moose in our western study area, which is the Greenville, Jackman, Forks area, in 7 of those years, 6 out of 7 of those years, we lost greater than 50% of our calves died. Collared calves died.
Wow.
Every one of those years, 6 out of 7. And the seventh year, the outlier, was like at 48%.
Wow.
So you know what I mean? And in the worst year, it was 72%. And so when I get a text message on my phone from this guy, which is called the Grim Reaper.
Okay.
So the Grim Reaper texts me and says, there's a mortality out there. And that's when, that night I call up the guys. I say, hey, we got to go tomorrow morning. We're going up to the northern road. We got dead moose that we'll go do.
What exactly is causing the mortality? Is it just blood loss?
So that's a great question. So what happens is that when the moose calf goes into winter, relative to a cow or a bull, the cow and the bull, just like deer, are trying to get as much fat on their body as they can while there's still green matter out there. And then they're going to have that fat and carry it through the winter and metabolize that fat to get them through to the next green period come May, June, right? So that's how a moose and a deer function. So if you have plenty of body fat on you, you can survive the winter and do pretty good. A moose calf who's 400 pounds in January is still trying to grow a skeleton. It's trying to grow a body. It accumulates barely any fat.
Trying to build lean body mass.
Yeah, very lean going into the fall. So it's at risk. So now it goes into January. It's acquired all these ticks. Now the ticks start feeding. And if you have 60,000 ticks, by the time the ticks morph into adults, an adult female tick, because it has to create and make eggs, can take 1 ml of blood.
Wow.
So the winter ticks take so much blood in such a short window of time that
60,000 mLs.
Yeah, that the moose calf especially cannot replenish and build the blood back into itself in the shorter period of time
way.
when it's devoid of protein and good food on the environment. So a 400-pound moose that dies in March or in April has lost 20 to 30% of its body weight and is emaciated from being fed on by ticks. And so you can see that there's compounding effects along with that. I mean, they'll have other parasites, but the driver is the winter tick. So in a year, with 2 study areas, we can compare what happens with climate and the amount of snow on the ground and then the number of ticks. And so our western unit and our northern unit on the border of New Brunswick were different latitudinally and with the length of snow and the number of ticks, blah, 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 so that the northern unit only had 1 out of 5 years with an epizootic where we lost greater than 50%. And in that year, the snow depth and consistency was really difficult. So we had
high.
We had deep snow, which is an energetic demand for a calf at 400 pounds, and it was sugar snow. So I have a picture of me on the snowmobile where I just jumped off and I just was right up to my waist, like nothing. There was no resistance. Yeah. And so you think of the moose going through there, in the size of a moose calf versus a cow. And then the other thing is just body volume and blood. So you take 60,000 ticks on a 400-pound moose, then look at it at an 800-pound moose.
Right.
And she can survive that.
Yeah.
So it's blood loss that causes a state of anemia, chronic anemia,
okay,
and emaciation.
Can you describe what that looks like? Obviously, I don't mean just the emaciated animal, but I hear that the ticks can be so thick on the hide. It's
if somebody isn't used to this or doesn't understand the dynamic of how does a small tick kill a moose, it's like you say, where it's I have a classic picture of me holding my big hands like this. Maybe that's 5 inches by 5 inch circle that I can create with my hands. I get gloves on a calf moose, and when we approached that dead calf, this was on the side of Moose Mountain, just below the ski area, up outside of Greenville. We approached that calf. It had a pretty nice coat on it because a lot of these calves, especially early in the season, do not behaviorally react to the ticks on them.
So you mean nice coat because he's not scratching against everything?
Off.
Yeah.
And so I plucked the hair on that moose, and then I have a picture. In my hands there's nothing but ticks, adult ticks.
So it's like scales on a reptile or something.
Well, you think about piglets trying to feed on mom,
yeah,
nurse on mom, and they're all trying to squeeze in there to suckle.
Oh, that's
and there's
disgusting.
no room. Oh,
that's
yeah,
disgusting.
And it's pretty amazing. And so we've looked at ticks for all these years and hair loss and systematically and what that looks like. And we weigh these moose at mortality, so we know the weight change because weigh them at capture 400 pounds. Weigh them at mortality, and they've lost 30% of their body weight. Okay. And it's crazy.
I have 2 questions about this. One is I'd like to understand better how climate change is driving this. And then second to that is long term, is this a really serious problem that moose are facing? Or is this something that you think they can adapt to and live with? Or is this is this dire consequences here?
Well, so the challenge here is that the conventional wisdom, the scientific wisdom is, and it's changed just in the 7 years. We used to think that the end product, the spring, had the most impact on the female ticks dropping eggs. But what we've discovered is that it's really the fall is what drives the number of ticks on a moose. So what happens here is that the ticks are getting on the moose when the temperatures are fine and mild. And it's not until temperatures fall well below freezing, and we start to get snow on the ground. Right now we're thinking, based on the data we have, that it's several days of snow on the ground. So already in the last 10 years we've changed from a day of snow to needing multiple days with snow on the ground. And that blankets the ticks, and not only does it inactivate the ticks, but it kills them. So picture a moose walking through the woods. Every day you're accumulating ticks on you, ticks, and then the weather comes and all the ticks are dead, and that's the number of ticks you have on you. Well, if that's below a certain number, you're going to be all right. It's going to impact you. You're going to lose some weight, but you're going to survive. Well, that curtain doesn't shut down, and you still collect ticks on you every day, every week, and now you have a lethal load on you.
Okay.
And that's going to kill you.
So if it's not freezing hard early enough in the season, the number of ticks to pick up is higher,
right,
and you go into the winter with more of them.
Right. And then people, so you poke holes at this, right? So it's like, does the weather shut down and kill every tick? Well, some places.
Yeah, microclimates.
at that very small scale, some places have more ticks than others. Maybe some survive better than others. We have people, postdocs, that we're working on this and trying to understand how this dynamic works. But that's basically what's happening. Now, as we've seen in 8 years now, and I was mentioning it before with the northern study area, is in a good year, we had survival of those calves that take the brunt of this at 85%. So we only lost 5 of our calves that year for a loss mortality of 15%, 1-5. So when somebody says, well, what's the best case scenario? Well, the best case scenario is everything comes together. You have a rotten winter in a human viewpoint, but good in my viewpoint, that shuts down the ticks. And then your calves are surviving and doing well. And they're going to make it to their first birthday. Yeah. And once a moose makes it to their first birthday, their survival rate is going to start to look like the survival rates of adults, which are still very high.
Okay.
So that's that dynamic. But in a bad year, and with the climate,
in other words, in a warm winter,
in a warm fall,
okay,
what the climate guys who actually know the stuff at Orono have said is that we've lost 2 weeks of winter. So in other words, right now in Maine, our summer, fall is 2 weeks longer. Now, to some people, they're like, that's great. Right. I like warm weather. I can't stand it. I can't stand the snow. Okay, well, it's Maine. And ecologically, 2 weeks is a problem.
Yeah.
And it's a problem for moose. And we also believe, based on good science, that, again, what I described here with Grant about the impact of ticks on a moose, you're a cow moose, and you're pregnant. Well, you go into winter fat. Now, starting into January and February, your fetus is really developing. So you're feeding 2 things. You're feeding yourself
and your tick load.
Right. And you need to be able to produce milk and lactate. And we know that lactation is a significant energy demand.
Of course.
So now you get all those ticks. You're losing
all
body
that
mass.
nutrition that's in milk. I mean, that's got to come right out of you.
So what we think is happening is a moose calf at birth should weigh 35 pounds. And what we've seen, and this is more on the anecdotal observational side, is we've seen multiple cases, probably between, I don't know what it is, 5 to 10, where we've seen stillborn calves and dead calves drop next to the calf that are way underweight, and they're never going to make it.
Yeah.
So, it's clearly, if you do the work and look at it from an energetic standpoint, which my mentor and professor at the University of New Hampshire did. He published a paper on this, which clearly demonstrates what an impact ticks can be on a surviving adult.
Yeah.
And for a female with a fetus, it's not pretty.
But unfortunately, the trend is not towards winters getting cold again anytime soon.
Right. I mean, it's especially in that adaptive unit, what's been really interesting is that in a year where calf mortality to the yearling stage is less and reproduction increases a little bit, you can stabilize and potentially increase your population in that year. But then it all slides back. Mm-hmm. So it's a 1 step forward. Right now, it looks to be a 1 step forward, 3 step back process with winter tick.
Yeah.
Where it's so consistent.
So this long term, what's the prognosis?
Well, that's the question for the climate folks, because as we know, and what people don't seem to understand is that climate change is affecting the entire world. How is it affecting your backyard? Well, that may look different, right? Mm-hmm. We know that, right, as you go into the northern hemisphere and the Arctic, it has a much more profound effect on things than it does as you go to other areas.
South,
And so, that drives me crazy with people, because we know that this is a real phenomenon and it's affecting things, and this is what it's doing in Maine.
Mm-hmm.
But what it means for Maine is a challenge, because we see just in a degree latitude difference or more that the far north on the border of Canada does better than Western Maine. So how is that going to look in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years? I can't answer that question.
Right. Okay.
But, what's it going to mean for moose? It's likely going to mean that population that are suffering from winter tick are going to shrink. That distribution is going to shrink. And so that leads to the adaptive unit. So the adaptive unit is our best management strategy to try to break the tick cycle. So we know we can't spray the moose, we can't spray the woods, because we're going to kill every insect and everything out there. And so you have to try to decrease the density of moose, because we know that the phenomenon of winter tick and parasites and disease like COVID-19, you're more at risk when you're in a dense population.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the best way I understand that. So when we have a dense moose population, they're sharing all kinds of things, including winter tick. In fact, the same moose that live and breathe in the springtime with winter ticks on their back are dropping those winter ticks. Then they're going out in the big wide world of moose, and then they're picking them up the following fall in the same area from themselves or related moose.
Reinfecting themselves.
And so it's a chronic thing. And so the only way that we feel from a management action is to try to demonstrate whether through reduction of a moose density to a lower population, whether we can affect and break the tick cycle.
Okay.
And so we increase the permits to reduce the cow numbers and decrease the population within a unit area, which is this adaptive unit, because obviously the public, in trying to understand this dynamic, it's a big challenge. And then on top of that, people see less moose, and then you tell people, well, in order to decrease the population, even though you're seeing less, we need to remove cows and calves.
Calves are on there's tags for calves.
Well, it's an antlerless tag, so you can shoot a cow or a calf. And the reality is, in the biological world, if you had a situation where you're going to lose 70% of your calves in the spring, you would harvest those calves in the fall.
Yeah, it's not even additive mortality in most cases.
Exactly. It's absolutely compensatory. And the thing is, the moose in the fall are healthy as can be. They're in their best shape.
Yeah.
And so first you have to believe in the ethic of hunting.
Yeah.
And the majority of Mainers are strong proponents of hunting. And then you have to make the leap to the calf thing, which is a challenge. But yes, the antlerless permit.
But that comes from like the sociological side of the house, not from the biological side. That's just that's like the good sportsmanship kind of mentality of the early part of the conservation movement that's still kind of lingering.
Yep.
So go ahead.
No, so we're, as part of this, there comes a point where we know what's happening. We know the impact that ticks are having on moose, and we need to move forward with a strategy. Mm-hmm. And that's what we're doing.
It's an experiment.
And yes, at a smaller scale. And the important thing here, too, about this adaptive unit that people also need to understand is we have the ability to measure what we're doing. Mm-hmm. So versus sometimes people will implement things that they can't tell you exactly what happened. Because of our ability to do aerial survey work, because of our ability to count winter ticks and associate tick numbers with mortality, because of our ability to gauge and assess reproductive output, we can do all that stuff, and we can see what things look like as of last year, because we started with all of that work even before that. And then in 5 years, as this progresses through, every year we can be looking and checking back and looking as we progress through this.
When will the public hear about those data and what you've learned? Because this is year one of the adaptive hunt?
Yeah, this will be the first hunt this fall where we've increased those permits and where we're trying to figure out, because the other tough thing about the North Woods is it only has so much capacity. We only have a framework for our current hunt. Right. And when we can hunt moose and how many people we can actually fit in there to hunt. We don't want people crawling over each other. Right. And people have, last week we did a online briefing. Everybody had to attend the briefing, 550 permittees. And they had to listen to me go on about moose, and so the words.
All these people are listening to you go on about moose right now, and they don't have tags at all.
I know, it's painful.
But no, so you were explaining to them what
everything,
just how this all works, what they're participating in.
It's it's all about trying to understand the purpose of the hunt, how we're going to measure this. Yeah. We talk about meat care. Yeah. That's in the moose hunt. That's more critical today than ever, and I'm it's just very important, from so many perspectives. Just camping in the North Woods, all the regulations, the things that people need to know so they can go out there and really know what they're doing and enjoy themselves.
But you guys will be collecting data this winter and you'll be able to start to see if there's any.
We started last year. We collared moose there, 70 moose last year in that unit. We focus any flights we're going to do start in that unit. So we're counting moose last year. Reproductive data.
Wow, it'll be interesting to see the stuff roll in. I'm excited to.
I'm going up there Monday.
Okay, wow. And then what about brainworm?
Brainworm has always been out there in the public's eye because when a moose walks into town and starts, turning circles and charging somebody's truck or something, we hear about it. And a lot of that time it has to do with this nasty little worm that invades the central nervous system, which is the meningeal worm or brainworm. And The thing is that in states that have higher deer numbers, and some of this has been, we continue to learn more about this worm, but, deer are a carrier of meningeal worm, and they pass it on in their feces, and moose, it's all part of this cycle. But the deer aren't affected by it. We don't see mortality from a deer with brainworm, but moose do. And
deer are adapted to it.
Yeah, and so there's this great crazy, and this is part of the climate change thing too, which is, there's always been this dynamic with deer and moose that, when you get deer above a certain number, it's usually 15 to 20 per square mile, you start to really exclude moose. And why do you do that? It's not because of habitat. It's really because of all the parasites, the nasty parasites that deer carry.
No kidding.
That don't seem to impact them.
Okay, because moose are deer, so they are susceptible to all these same parasites and infections, but they're a different species with a different, natural history and life history.
Right. So you have the same family, that's elk, deer, moose, and caribou, and they share lots of nasty things. But the moose seem to be take it on the chin more. And the theory is that, coming across the land bridge and all that, the whitetail has been in North America a lot longer, dealing with these pests than the moose has, and the moose is the newcomer. And
he lives a solitary lifestyle where the deer are sort of in and around each other all the time, huh?
Yeah, it's definitely which is another point I want to make about moose and our adaptive, which is moose live at low densities. You look across North America and the range of moose, and there's few places you're going to find moose densities as high as we have in parts of Maine, even in light of winter tick.
Okay.
So Newfoundland has high densities of moose, and Scandinavia does that. But you look across Canada and any place in the United States where there's moose, and you're going to find, a moose living at about a moose per square mile.
Okay.
And that's hard for people to conceptualize. We live in an area where, down where you live, deer, you're talking probably 15 to 20 per square mile, if not more. And it's hard to conceptualize this square mile thing unless you live it. But a moose density that gets up to 2, 3, 4, 5 per square mile, that is a lot of moose per square mile. That's a bigger footprint that they have, literally and figuratively.
We saw in Newfoundland that people don't like driving at night, and then they cut the foliage back, about 15 feet on the side of the highway, and they like to drive with one person spotting the roadside while the other person watches the road. They are paranoid about it, and I thought, well, we put up signs at home, but not that worried about it,
Well, DOT has done a lot. Our transportation department has done a lot of stuff to mitigate for this. They've taken salt licks on the sides of roads and filled them in. They've put cobblestone type of riprap down to make it unfriendly for moose. Up there in eastern Aroostook County, they have places where when you come by, I think it's Route 163 or 161, they have these kind of they're not signs, but there's reflections there, reflective signs that, and I'm saying this all wrong, forgive me DOT, but it lights up that area. It makes it look, it's not lights, but the reflection of your car lights makes it so you can see better. You can see the road
no
better.
Kidding. Oh, that's cool.
Because obviously moose, we don't have as many collisions as we did back in 99, 2000, but it takes one collision to kill somebody.
Yeah, right, or more than one. So the brainworm, not a real serious issue like when we're talking about the winter tick. That's the more pressing.
No, and that's evident by the fact that our adult survival rates are, 90% plus.
Yeah. Okay.
So if meningeal worm was a big issue, you would see much higher mortality.
Yeah.
Meningeal worm comes into play when we got the moose, in Bangor running around, let's say, that's acting funny. And then we need to respond to that. Okay.
And obviously we're really lucky right now here that we're not dealing with CWD, but this is an issue that will affect moose over time.
Chronic wasting disease, moose have actually gotten it in Colorado and Wyoming. Yeah. And it doesn't have the prevalence that it does in things like mule deer, seem to be very susceptible, and elk. The closest CWD came was to Quebec, and they had a pretty good response.
And that was like an individual case though, right? That was sort of an isolated event.
Yeah, and I think that was a captive deer.
Yeah.
But there's concern because once it's in, and it causes a shift in your hunting mentality too. You start to think, I do at least. I've hunted out west where I'm like, do I want to deal with that, or what do you want to do? It's something that makes you think a little differently. Yeah. And as you said, moose seem to be less susceptible because they don't feed low to the ground. So if a deer dies here with CWD and you can't see the dead deer anymore, but it had CWD, those prions are still there.
Yeah.
And the deer that comes along feeding on the ground can pick it up, but a moose feeds up higher.
Browsing
for the most
up
part.
higher. Yeah. Yeah. So the winter tick is the main thing.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Does that winter tick transmit diseases as well?
It does not, as far as we know, knock on wood. You know, it's, as you all know, the deer tick is the primary driver through all these nasty diseases.
So many of them.
Lyme, babesia, ehrlichiosis, all this.
Powassan.
Powassan. And then the dog tick doesn't carry much in the way...
doesn't transmit much, what I read, but can carry.
Yeah.
You know,
but the winter tick, we've tested winter tick, and we're lucky in Maine because we got the folks down at the Vector-Borne Disease Lab. We got the tick experts down there in Portland. I mean, it's really an amazing state we got, and they test ticks, and then we got the folks at Orono. We got a huge number of folks looking at ticks, so it's good stuff.
I got a tick tested up in Orono.
Yeah.
It was positive.
Well, I mean, you know, you've probably talked about it a lot, but I mean, for people who spend time in the woods, and really for deer hunters and turkey hunters, you know, where I live near here, it's bad.
Yeah.
And it makes you know, I mean, I'm a diehard deer hunter, so it's kind of like, you know, I put all my clothes in a permethrin bath, in a 5-gallon bucket of diluted permethrin. Inside out, those are my tick clothes, and that's what I wear. In the springtime, you know, I like to turkey hunt, but I have more resistance because I'm just like this year the dog ticks were crazy.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Just exploded.
Yeah.
And it's like, I don't know if I want to just...
I feel bad because they're all coming out of my backyard. We're the epicenter, I'm pretty sure.
Right,
So,
yeah.
yeah, there's a hole in the backyard to hell, and they all come out of there. And so let's apologize to everybody. I saw this year, I got so excited. I was down in Kentucky, not here, but I saw my first Lone Star tick.
Oh.
And it's on me, and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. Look. You know?
Yeah.
And everybody's like, what are you talking about? That's terrible. And it's like, but I've never seen one. This phenomenon. Because you remember growing up, it's like that. I grew up in Dover, moved to Maine when I was a teenager. I never saw a tick until, 10 years ago, started seeing them.
We've lived in the same house for 16 years. When we moved back east from Washington State, never thought about ticks. And it was just like, this is great. And then I'm going to say between 5 and 10 years ago, we started to pick up deer ticks. In fact, we have 2 blonde dogs on purpose because as they walk,
Right,
we walk
you
the
can
dogs.
see 'em.
Well, we literally know, you know, and having kids, it's like, hey, guess what? You know, we got to start being careful right now because the ticks are out, you know, and then we know when they're not out anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And
My dog's how I know in this. Yeah, like now we're in that nice pause before they kick up again in the fall, and you know I know it because my dog's not picking them up. But I just got back from Jewel Island. I did a few days of camping out there, so those coastal islands are so bad, and the nymphs are so difficult to spot. I found a couple on me. I walked through the interior of the island, and I mean to say the size of a period on a page is generous. They're not even quite that big. You know?
Yeah, I mean, how do you? And literally, you know, I feel so bad, you know, because how would people? It's a speck.
Yeah.
It's like people say, it's like, oh, I don't remember that mole being there. Or
Yeah,
something. I
yeah.
mean, it's crazy.
Yeah,
You couldn't
yeah.
make that stuff up.
Yeah, I know, it's scary. It's like I'd rather have wolves and mountain lions to think about than ticks. But on to the hunt for moose, man. I'm curious if you just have any input on. There's a range of stuff that I see from people who go into the backcountry to people hunting the dirt roads. I'm just curious your thoughts on, I don't know if you have anything to say about the hunt or directions you'd like to see that hunt go or anything like that culturally. Yeah.
I love it. You know, moose hunting is it's in so many ways.
Yeah.
I mean, it is a cultural heritage. And, you know, unfortunately, you know, a lot of folks run into, you know, other things and get a bad taste for things. But, you know,
What do you mean?
Well, for hunters, you know, and the majority of hunters, you know, are good sports people. And it's, you know, you think about a moose hunt and what that can provide a family. You know, we talk about all these movements and everything, but, you know, a moose you can get hundreds of pounds of organic meat. And if you treat it the right way,
very good meat.
You know, it's just unbelievable.
Oh, good meat.
And the thing about the moose hunt that's a frustration to me, you know, as a biologist and as a hunter, is that, you know, with warming temperatures, people need to, you know, again, hunting, as you know, is very personal. So it's not, you can't tell anybody how to do it. You do it your way. But we do have an ethical, you know, it's very important to you're going to take an animal like a moose, and out of respect, you want to use everything you can on that moose for that great meat. And so we've been trying to encourage people to learn about techniques like the gutless method, quartering a moose. We've done professional videos on our website right here in Maine. And we really encourage that, because the bottom line is that, people think when it's in the 40s that it's pretty nice for moose hunt, but the reality is that bacteria starts to grow above 40 degrees. We know that because what is our refrigerator set to? And you would never treat a piece of nice Angus beef like you would some of these moose. And it can be horrifying to me, because we have a tradition in Maine which started, and it's crazy. So in 1980 we required people, to bring out the whole moose. You got the moose, you bring out the whole moose. And Mainers are the most ingenious people. They love to figure out ways to get moose out of the woods. And I get that. I mean, it's like a bonding experience to get a big moose out of the woods.
Right.
Now, if the conditions are right and it's in the 30s, fantastic. You are good to go. Last year, when I was working in Fort Kent, it was 80 degrees out during the moose hunt.
Oh, wow.
And when I had two guys my age come out and look at me like, we just spent 7 hours trying to twitch this moose out, I'm looking at them like,
guts in it?
No, they got the moose out and then spend 7 hours trying to. You can't manhandle an 800-pound animal out of the woods.
Yeah.
And the amount.
Oh man, all around those hip joints must have just been soured.
Well, the length that people go with equipment to do this when it's easier.
I've seen a half a canoe and a chainsaw winch works pretty good. I've seen it.
Oh, like I said, I mean, a lot of the guides and everything, they do that, and they do a great job at it. And if the temperatures are right, and that's what you want to do, go for it. But for other people, to me, and with the adaptive hunt, we talk a lot about this, which is you really got to know it's a 6-day hunt. You know what the weather's going to be. Yeah. The sign is there. You know that moose are impacted by the weather as far as behaviorally. And so when you get those warm temperatures, you want to be prepared.
Have a plan.
And have multiple plans. And be prepared. And really, I tell people, listen, if I can do it, I swear to God, I mean, anybody can do it. You know what I mean? And when I did my moose hunt in 2014, and I told my buddy, I said, listen, when you come up here, number one, it's a big unit 4. We're not going to drive all over creation. I mean, you can't, there's no gas stations. I don't want that hunt. We're going to go in the woods, and when we shoot a moose, we'll quarter it up, and we'll put it in the game bags, and we'll pack it out. What do you think? Perfect. And I wound up shooting a moose about a mile in, and it was just like, cool, let's do it. And the meat was unbelievable, and I expand my cooking repertoire. But you hear people say, I've had people at check stations where like, so you eat that, and it's like,
oh my goodness,
right. So
what are you talking about?
So you want to do everything you can to keep off the dirt, to keep off, any fluids, to keep the flies off. Yeah. And what a better way than to bag your meat? Yeah. Literally to
carry out
put it in
quarters.
game bags.
Yeah, man. I gotta say too, the meat's really good, and then also you got marrow bones, which on deer you just don't really end up with that, and that bone marrow is so good too, and those femurs and stuff. But I know I hunt bears, and I just notice a lot of folks go in the woods with no plan, and it's hot out. We get these bears.
We have a rule change coming up this fall on October 18th that was passed this year, which is now for big game, including bear and deer and moose. You will be required, if you part out your animal in the woods, and you can do that with deer.
Yeah, you can part out deer this year.
And bear, right. Yeah. You'll be required to take the head out. Okay, so that's a little different tweak than, as you're familiar with, in Western states. So you still need to bring the whole head out. But hey, to me it's a game changer, because, I always said, you had to bring out the whole deer. Yeah. So, you go in the woods 2 miles, and when, I'm in all right shape for a guy my age.
But 2 miles of deer dragging.
Right, and if you can quarter it up, it's like, that is a game changer, because now you're not sitting there wondering. So when I did my moose, the beauty of it was, it was, we had scouted through the weekend, and it was a Monday morning, and I was going to take whatever moose it was, unless it was little spikes. All worked out beautifully, nice hunt. And it's like everything, once the moose was down, and we're thankful for that, was happy, because now we got this moose bagged up. We did 1.5 trips each to get that moose out. The only thing we brought in the woods was a couple little backpacks.
How'd you do a half trip?
So that's an old guide's trick. So do you know this trick?
No.
So my friends, if you know, I give them credit. Of course, it was the Conovers, if you ever knew them, Garrett and Alexandra. But they taught us that when you're on a portage trail or any trail and you're carrying stuff. So me and my buddy Bill are at the moose. We get everything bagged out, ready to go. The first guy goes to the truck with his gear and all his stuff, as much as he carries. Meanwhile, I'm working up additional stuff, and I start after him a little while. So he goes all the way to the truck. I go halfway to my halfway point, my guest point. I dump all my gear at the halfway point. Then I come back for the last load. Meanwhile, he comes to the halfway point, grabs that gear, and goes back.
Cool.
Instead of doing 2 trips each,
That's great.
we did 1.5.
That's great.
So we had our plan. We got back to my truck. I actually had I had a cooler that we had packed with ice and stayed cold. Threw all the meat in there except for shoulder and some loose meat.
You boned it all out.
No, it was the quarters, but all the neck meat.
I love some venison.
Yeah, back straps and everything else. So all that goes into your game bags.
Yeah.
We get back to the camp, and we could just sit back like nothing. And then, of course, the other point, and we told this to the hunters in the North Maine woods and the adaptive hunt, is that you also have the problem with dust. So you're traveling these dusty roads.
Wow, and it'll infiltrate your vehicle even with your windows up.
Yeah. So I had everything. And again, it's just that's the way I did it. It's not a brag. It's just like that's my thought process. But everything was covered in a canvas tarp. Yeah. And everything was tightened down, and there wasn't dust getting in anywhere or anything.
It'd be amazing what people would accomplish with just maybe a cooler and a tarp sometimes, It's just people seem a lot of times like they're going into the woods almost expecting not to succeed or something. And then when they do, there's not a good plan in place.
Well, and because we have so much data on field-dressed moose, how much they weigh, the age of the moose, the antler spreads, based on some of that information, you part out your moose and you tell me, you told me I shot a 6.5-year-old bull. And I can say to you, well, that weighed probably 800 pounds based on the data. Okay. So if I told you it was 800 pounds, but it was really 825, would that offend you?
So you're saying that
some people they don't like that.
Right. But a lot. So that's one reason for the sometimes poor care is because they want to get a whole animal onto the scale because it's about the numbers.
Yeah. Well, and that's fine. It's not a
that ethos seems to be changing amongst the new crop of hunters. It seems like less important. It seems like there's a shift underway in the thinking around a lot of this stuff because you got sort of the old guard. That's how they were raised up with that mentality, which was the correct response to the market hunt. It was like the good sporting type hunt. But now there's this movement back towards the food component of it, which is interesting. So it seems like there's a change in
we
thinking.
Could probably at some point have somebody look at it with our data and say, because, there's a feeling that I would agree with you. There's probably more people that are parting out their moose, and that's always a good thing. I mean, the fact is, if the thermometer is going to be about 50 degrees and higher, that's just what you got to do.
Yeah. Here's one of those crazy questions that I know it can't really be answered, but if it was you and you got to make a rule like this is the moose caliber for Maine, what's the
moose caliber?
Yeah, what's your caliber
that's funny.
choice?
It's funny because I'm a late onset hunter.
Yeah, me too.
Right?
Yeah.
And I think back when I started hunting in the late 90s as a younger-ish man than I am now, and how much as the years gone by I enjoy it more and more and more and more. And then you start to look at things like caliber and bullet types and things more seriously than when I first started and what I knew then. And, I shot my moose with a 270. Okay. But I think...
How many times?
How many times? Well, that was at like 20 yards. And, that's another... I apologize. I've never listened to your podcast, so I don't know what you actually do. But so point blank range, the moose just stood there. Yeah. Right. Which is always an interesting thing.
Double lung.
Yeah. But it just stood there. And so, good, bad, or otherwise, that's the way it is that there's no instant death unless an animal gets hit in the spinal cord. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And even then, I've shot deer that have gone down what seems like instantly, but there's a time lag. But anyway, so I shot that moose a second time for sure because it's just standing there, and it's not the most pleasant thing to witness. But and we've of course we've had to once in a while you have to dispatch moose and things like that. Right. But, so I don't know. There's so many great calibers out there. I have a 35 Whalen.
Oh yeah. It's got a punch.
Yeah, it does. Obviously that's a good moose. gun. Everybody loves a 308 and a 30-06.
Yeah.
I mean,
I shoot 308s.
but that's a whole nother conversation.
Yeah, it's like, and there's I know it's so like, nuanced and stuff, but I just wonder about those 240s. Yeah.
But let's step back. One thing I would say is that, clearly with moose, as in any species, it's all about shot placement, and it's all about your practice and range. And I think one of the things that's unfortunate about moose, especially if people aren't used to seeing a lot of moose, and we have to practice this a lot with darting because we do it at close range, which is, you sit there and some people think they're so good at that's 50 yards, that's 100 yards.
Oh, yeah, it's hard to
Well, it makes
them.
a big difference. And you look at a moose out in a clear cut versus a deer in a clear cut. Now, if you don't have a rangefinder, it's really, and the thing is, as a biologist, we see a lot of bad things. Okay. I've checked, I can't tell you how many hundreds of moose that I have checked, right, at check stations. I work them every year. There needs to be an ethical shot.
Yeah.
That would be the goal every time.
Right.
A 99% shot.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, as a biologist, as a hunter, that's going to be my shot, 99%, and anything below that. And I know that's tough for people,
Yeah, it's just like if you knew your bullet drop and had a rangefinder, though, you can account for so much of that. It's just, it's just like not everybody's thinking that, and understand that ballistics are so complicated and gets over people's heads, and it can be a barrier to entry. But once you know what your projectile does and at what distances it does what, man, it's really helpful.
Well, I just sit here looking at you guys thinking, God, to get in this conversation, I could see myself just getting skewered. But I think of these terminologies coming up these days with anchoring the animal.
Yeah.
And this, and then
for people listening, that means taking a shot that structurally damages the animal so it can't move. Right?
Yeah,
so you're like trying to hit in the spine or something.
And in fairness, like I think with big game. Like bighorn sheep or something, like somebody who's like up on a cliff face, and
it's got
they'll
drop
anchor
off
them because it doesn't fall off the cliff. But these kind of things leak out into the mainstream and get used in places where it's pretty unethical.
Yeah, and with a moose, people can get closer to a moose, and they can get a high percentage ethical shot. And I know, there's a lot of temptation out there and all that, but
Yeah, I hear you, and I know it's delicate with your job. I've only been on one moose hunt, so a lot of these questions are actual, real practical. I'm not trying to lead you. They're like my actual. One day I'll draw, and I'm like curious about all this. I know
one day we all will.
Right. I went with a buddy as his sub-permittee, and we decided he was a butcher. We wanted to cut that moose ourselves, and I remember everybody up there in the North Woods was like, "What do you mean you're going to do this moose yourself?" Like realizing, oh, that's not something people are doing up here. They're all going to the. They're going to the game butcher. And so, the guide was great. They hung it for us off a tractor, and we got to do it ourselves. And I'll say, bring a knife sharpener. My goodness, that's a lot of animal.
Yeah.
It's a lot of animal. But any kind of closing thoughts that you want to share? Anything about moose? Anything about the story? Anything about Maine? Anything you want to say to folks?
We'd be here all day.
Yeah.
All week. I'm here all week.
Lee, thanks for today, and thanks for the work you're doing, and thanks for sharing so openly about it. Really appreciate it.
You bet, anytime.
Thanks for listening to the WildFed podcast. You can help us grow this show by subscribing and leaving us a rating and review. It ensures better rankings and more advertiser interest, which translates directly into better shows, more awesome guests, and a constant stream of fresh, new content. Have a question you'd like answered on the show, or a hunting, fishing, or foraging trip you'd like to host us on? Email us at info@wild-fed.com. And be sure to visit our website, wild-fed.com, to check out the WildFed video show and store. WildFed. Food is all around you.